Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Megan Crouch here again for our third week of our Women of the Old Testament Bible study. If you missed today, I'm so happy that you're catching up and watching it online. Be sure to leave us comments or get in touch with me if you have any questions. We love to hear from you. Just letting you know, if you are looking for the study guide that goes along with this, you can go to our website. That is peacegaylord.net, peacegaylord.net. And under ministries, go to Figuring Out Faith, click on that, and then scroll down and you will see this week's video, or the video will be there. And if you can just click on that and you can download the study guide, that'll go along the key points, so to speak, that'll go with today's lesson. And with that, let's dive right into the lesson itself as we start to talk about the women of Exodus. I particularly love this book of the Bible, and I think it's because I've learned so much about it as I've grown. Exodus is one of those books in the Bible that we love to write about, that we love to put into movies. It's an amazing story. It resonates with people, and because of that, it's one of the most popular stories in the Bible that we see represented in popular media. Things like Charlton Heston's The Ten Commandments, which I grew up watching, The Prince of Egypt, which is a fabulous and beautiful movie, and even to some extent Exodus Gods and Kings, which I would say is maybe not the most representative story, but all of these cultural representations of the book of Exodus fall short in some way, shape, or form, and they impact how we see the story and how we understand it. And one of the ways that they do that is they often change or leave out various women and their roles within the story. So, to let you kind of get into it, there are about 6 women in the story, and they all play an incredibly important role. In fact, the story itself would not be possible without them. And before we get too much further into it, I want to remind everyone that one of the primary lessons I've learned about reading the Bible is that God is always the main character. All right. God is always the main character of the story. It's never Abraham or David or Moses. It's not any of the women we're going to talk about today. This is the story of God and God's people and creation. And so that will be important in how we're going to understand and read about these women today as well. So let's jump in and start by meeting some of these amazing and strong women. The first women that we would meet as we start talking about women in Exodus are the 2 midwives, Shippa and Puah. They deceived the Pharaoh, and these may or may not have been Egyptian women. They might have been Hebrew women, they might have been Egyptian women. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that they were responsible for helping oversee births and helping women in labor, and that they worked with Egyptian and Hebrew women both. The second woman we meet in the story is Moses' mother, who follows the letter of the law, but not the intent of the law, by placing Moses in the river in a basket. Very important. Miriam, his sister, is the third one. She watches over him and intercedes on behalf of Pharaoh, or on his behalf with Pharaoh's daughter. And later she becomes a prophetess and leads people in worship, which is beautiful as well. Pharaoh's daughter, of course, plays the role of adopting Moses and thus saving him from the river. And finally, Moses' wife, Zipporah, saves his life on the journey from Egypt and stays with him and travels with him. And these are all amazing women for multiple reasons. But one of the big things is that they represent creation and the creative acts. Jamie Clark Souls says in her book, Women in the Bible, against the ruin of the world, there's only one defense, the creative act. Make no mistake that in Exodus, we are seeing the ruin of a world. We are seeing terror, tyranny, and death. These are people who are being killed off in basically what is amounts to genocide. And we see God at work through these women who are marginalized, overlooked, and outcast. And yet, God is at work in them and through them to save life and create hope and create new life. And it's an amazing and beautiful thing, one that we unfortunately miss when we marginalize and leave these women out of the Exodus story. And when we retell, change, or sexualize their roles in our current culture today to retell their stories in different ways, we miss the point of God working through people on the margins to challenge the powers of the ruling world. And at its heart, that is a lot of what Exodus is about, is that God is at work challenging the other quote unquote gods of the world around them, as seen through the Pharaoh and his power and authority, and the Egyptian gods, which God is seen battling, so to speak, in the plagues. But as we get into the story, we'll just have a little refresher here that Exodus starts off where Genesis leaves off. Joseph has gotten into Egypt and is an important person. His family has come and settled there, and there were many generations, and eventually problems occurred. And that's where our story picks up today. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they sent taskmasters over them to oppress them at the forced labor. They built supply cities, Bitman and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard surface in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all their tasks that they imposed upon them. This is a classic and very human story, one that has played out in our own country in modern days. It's playing out right now along our southern border. People have immigrated to a new culture and a new country. That's what Joseph and his family did to escape the famine. They found things, they created lives, they put down roots, and eventually they grew numerous. And the culture of that place started to become afraid of how these new people might change things, might threaten their old existence and old way. So they come up with the idea they don't want that change to happen. And these are, of course, God's people, the descendants of Abraham, through whom God is intending to bless the nations, all the nations. So them being there, settling, may have been part of God trying to bless the Egyptians. But we don't know, because we don't know, I don't know all of God's plan. But when we think about it like that, that's almost the first problem, is that humankind starts resisting that plan of God's to bless the nations, as the Israelites begin to have power and authority. So then the Egyptians become afraid. They try to subdue them into service and servitude, thinking that the hardship will reduce their numbers. That doesn't work. So Pharaoh comes up with even more terrifying plan. And this is where Shippa and Puah come in. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shippa and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birthing stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became strong. And because of the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now, there's some really interesting things going on in this text. One, Shiva and Pua are two of the first women to be named or actually the first people to be named in the book of Exodus. Scripture takes the care of preserving these women's names. Shiva means fair and Pua means splendid in Hebrew. They're beautiful names. The second becomes the question of why does the Pharaoh only want to kill the boys? Throughout Genesis, we see that the Israelite people are tracing their lineage, their heritage down through the males, the father's generation. You are the son of blank, you know, and insert father's name here. Women are seen much fewer in genealogies. Interestingly enough, and I would have to do more research on this to fully understand it, and if somebody does know more about it, I'd love to hear more about it. The Jewish people today often trace their ancestry through their mother's family, and part of me wonders if this becomes part of that. What is clear is that Pharaoh is attempting to get rid of the cultural identity, the family names, the things that would carry on when husbands took wives and carried on those family names. Um, he's attempting to destroy that by killing the male children. The women he keeps alive because he doesn't want to get rid of his workforce. And there's a lot of this in the story that dehumanizes women. The very fact that Pharaoh uh, buys the midwife's story, so to speak, is a perfect example of this. Shippa and Pua say that, well, the Israelites just give birth before we can get there. And Pharaoh, instead of um, arguing with that, shows a shocking lack of childbirth knowledge of how children are born, and says that, okay, fine, we'll just kill them after they're born. We'll throw all the male children into the river. This dehumanizing thing, this is almost like him believing, well, of course, those peasants don't, give birth the way we civilized folk do. I mean, it really is a dehumanizing, degrading belief. And beyond that, he thinks so little of the women and the girls being born that they are not people necessarily to him. They are just going to be a source of continued labor. So this becomes the real terror of what is going on. Infanticide is and remains one of the most horrific crimes that we encounter in culture. It has been historically throughout generations in almost every culture. And this is meant to evoke a sense of true fear and dread. Pharaoh, who is a god among men, is attempting to kill generations of people. And these midwives, what is really fascinating about them is that they come together and they are remembered because they stand up and they're almost taught between two gods, much like in the rest of Exodus. They are caught between God the Creator and God the Pharaoh, or the gods of Egypt. They obey God the Creator, Yahweh, Yud He Vav He, and they are the first of many illustrations of how God's power will be displayed and will prove to be more powerful than any of the so-called small g gods that we come up with in our own world and in our own societies. They fear or respect God more than they are afraid of the terror of Pharaoh, and they trust God. Their faith gives them the ability to stand up for and protect these new lives. By choosing to obey God instead of the Pharaoh, Shippa and Puah are empowered by God to save lives and subvert the terror that the Pharaoh is trying to inflict upon the Hebrew people. This is one of the first instances in the book where we see God again working through these marginalized people who have been devalued and dehumanized, and instead restoring power and dignity to them. As God says, these false gods are not in control. I am in control, and I am your God, and you are my people. And so this is beautiful. Unfortunately, most modern retellings of the book of Exodus leave these women out entirely. We miss the whole point of their story, and we miss this whole point of God's first interaction and really first conflict with the gods of Egypt as he acts through these women. And that's a tragedy that we see play out all too often when we leave their names. We, as a current culture, have failed to do what ancient Israelites did for so long, which was preserve the names of these two extraordinary women and what God did through them. So that is Shippa and Puah. Teach your kids their names, they're very important. Next, we meet two unnamed women, Moses' mother and sister. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. Now, remember, the Levites were the priestly class, one of the 12 tribes of Israel set aside for priestly duties. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine boy, fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. Then she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. All right, so here we have Moses' mother, who is named Jochebed in the Midrash and rabbinic traditions, but in the Bible does not have a name, and who many people believe is Miriam, who is connected with them later as his sister. And they are following the letter of Pharaoh's law, but not the intent of it. So again, God working through these marginalized people to subvert the power structures that would claim authority that is truly God's authority over life and death, authority over whether or not a group of people, a culture exists, authority over everything. And God uses them in this beautiful way, this charming story, really, to kind of say, nope, still not going to happen. There are other ways to subvert it. Technically, Moses' mother follows the law. She puts her baby boy in the Nile, but she does it so that he floats and stays alive. The other thing that is so important to notice here is that she raises Moses for 3 months. This means that Moses is very likely aware of the fact that he is an Israelite, because he probably would have been circumcised during those 3 months' time. A lot of retelling of the story of Exodus in our current culture likes to have this dramatic moment where Moses finds out he is born of a Hebrew woman and then has this horrible conflict of identities between his privileged Egyptian life and the slave lives of the Hebrew people. And that very likely didn't happen in the story. That's not a conflict that we see playing out in the Bible. One, because that's not the conflict the Bible is interested to tell. It's God's story again. And two, because Moses very likely knew he was Hebrew or Israelite from the beginning. He was probably circumcised. And as the next passage will show, he grew up with his mother for some time. In our next reading, the daughter of the Pharaoh came down to the river to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw a basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. Then she opened it and saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then her sister told, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So Pharaoh's daughter becomes the woman who draws Moses out of the water. But Pharaoh's sister, or Moses' sister, plays this wonderful role in which she goes and gets Moses' own mother to come and be the wet nurse for him. So Moses actually grows up with his family. And odds are very good that they would have, that he might have even extended some connection with them. We don't know what age that would be when they separated, but they do. The other thing, too, that's so interesting here is that in many modern retellings of the story, we either make it the Pharaoh's daughter, or the Pharaoh's daughter is either his wife, like in the Prince of Egypt, or they maybe in like in the Ten Commandments, it's still his daughter, but it's because she was recently widowed and cannot have children. We feel a need to put some kind of motivation on these women other than just the fact that they felt pity and they were moved by the cries of a child and responded with this loving gesture. I think that's very important because I think it says something too about the desire to nurture and protect life that we often see represented in women. The result of all these various actions is that Moses is saved and he gets to go ahead. The roles of these women that are downplayed, particularly the midwives, when we retell the story, really demean and demoralize, kind of help us miss the point of what God is truly doing in this text and what this text is truly trying to say, that the powers of this world may decree and say one thing is the reality is going to happen, but God is at work. And when people follow God and they respond and they listen and they work with God, then God at work through them changes and overcomes those powers of the world that would defy and try to build up our kingdom instead of God's. Now the story gets interesting. Moses grows up and he kills a Egyptian. This is more proof that Moses may have known about his heritage because he kills an Egyptian taskmaster who is beating a slave because he recognized that that was his kinsman and was angry about it. There was a murder, or the witness of the murder, the slave who was being abused, asked if he was going to kill him too, if Moses was going to kill him too. Moses realizes he can't cover up what he's done, and he ends up in trouble and fleeing from Pharaoh. That's where we pick up and meet Zipporah. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs of water for their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense, then watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. Now, Zipporah is one of those characters, again, whose image is usually greatly distorted in modern retellings. In the best cases, she is sexualized so that she attempts to be some kind of seductress or somebody who catches Moses's eye in some way. In the Prince of Egypt, she is this feisty, you know, woman who kind of fights back, and she's a pretty cool character actually in the Prince of Egypt. Does not mean she was like that in the Bible. We don't really know. What we know about Zipporah is that her name means bird. We don't know anything about what she looked like or acted like. We do know that she's a Midianite and that these were an Arab people who lived in the southern Transjordan area, northern Arabia, and in the Sinai. And in the Bible, these people are said to be the descendants of Abraham through his third wife, Keturah. That is the person that Abraham married after Sarah died. So, another one of Abraham's wives. But he had sons by her. One of them was Midian, and his descendants become the Midianites, who live in that area of the Sinai. Their exact religious practices aren't known. They may have worshipped the traditional Hebrew god Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh, or they may have worshipped other gods, Canaanite gods like Baal and Ashtar. We don't know. We do know that Jethro or Reuel, he's known as both, was a priest. So Zipporah would have been part of the or aware of religion, and that Zipporah has two sons for Moses, Gershom and Eleazar, neither of whom are circumcised as they attempt to travel back to Egypt with him. And that's going to be important in this next very strange part of the story. Moses, after the marriage, has a couple of kids and encounters the burning bush, which is the part of the story we all know well. It's beautifully represented in so many films. It's probably one of the best parts of more modern representations of this story, is this encounter with the divine. And God speaks to Moses and says, go with me, go. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to give you the tools. I'm going to help you know what to say. You're going to do this. And Moses actually is almost a stumbling block in his own sense. He says, no, I don't want to. I don't think I'm the right guy. I'm afraid I don't have the right speech. I'm not worthy to do this. And God says everything that Moses is going to say no to, God says yes. And so again, God's will is done, and Moses returns to Egypt. After the encounter with the burning bush, Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they are still living. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the people who are seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and sons and put them on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. So this is really important. One, I love that Moses, because I think if you told your father-in-law, hey, I'm going back to Egypt to start a revolution and free the slaves, he might have some reservations about letting you do it or taking his daughter and grandchildren with you. But there's also then this image that we have of Moses traveling back to Egypt. In so many of the modern retellings, Zipporah is completely cut out of the story here. She is just gone. And that's not what happened. Moses travels back to Egypt with his family. And I think that changes how we look at this. Instead of this lone man wandering across the desert with the wind blowing in his hair and his robe and the staff of God beside him, we see a family moving back in to talk to and engage with other families. We see that Aaron is going to go out and meet Moses. This is much more of a communal effort than it is an individual one. So that hero of a man standing up against the emperor or empire on his own is not so much the story that's being told here. It is much more the family, the community, the people standing against together that do it and make make that plea. In fact, Moses will meet with the elders and his brother Aaron before even attempting to go see the Pharaoh. And this, I think, is important for us to remember because we need to remember that women are a part of the process of freedom and rights and community restoration. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this at the very end, but they play an incredibly vital role. Not only that, but Moses might not have made it to Egypt. Otherwise, this is a very strange, and this is Exodus 4, by the way. I have a small typo in my text. In fact, you know what? I think I can fix that right now. Yeah, look at that. There we go. Now it's right. Exodus 4, 24 through 26. On the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him, meaning Moses. But Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was said, then she said, "A bridegroom of blood by circumcision. Excuse me. Exodus 4, 24 through 26. This is a fascinating part of the Bible that we don't read very often and we don't fully understand, to be honest. Um, Zephora says, Hata Dami. Dami means blood, and Hatan can either mean groom, bridegroom, or father in law. And there's some scholarly debate that says whether she flings the foreskin at Moses' feet and says, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me," or whether she flings it at God's feet and says, "You are a blood father in law to me." Either way, her actions end up saving Moses' life. And part of this, the whole why of this might be that part about her children not being circumcised, she might not have been Hebrew, and this might be her embracing her husband's religion by having her sons circumcised and therefore becoming fully a part of the community. Taking a little closer look, again, we don't know so many things about this. We don't know why God attacks Moses, just like we don't know why God attacked Jacob, when Jacob wrestled with him. We just know it happens. Um, we know that circumcision, which is normally done by a male priest, is suddenly being done by a potentially foreign woman. And that becomes an amazing and beautiful thing. We don't know exactly what, stops the attack, whether it was the circumcision, the declaration, what it was for, what it was caused. But what we do know is that Zephora is decisive. She acts, and through her action, and by uniting her family with Moses and God, she ends the attack, and Moses' life is spared. She is the fifth and possibly sixth woman to save Moses' life in this book. And that, I think, is another really telling thing about women as in their role of, once again, creating, protecting, and preserving life. Um, it's vitally important that we understand and value these, just like it's important that we understand and uh, value the roles of men in providing for, protecting, and nurturing life as well. Life and creation are what stand against hatred and war and terror. And that is what this community is standing up to. Eventually, they get to Egypt. Aaron goes out to meet Moses. Moses meets with the elders. He goes to the Pharaoh. He says, "Let my people go and worship our God in the wilderness." And yeah, you thought I was going to say, "Let my people go," right? Nope, it is let my people go and worship our God in the wilderness. And when Pharaoh says, why can't you do it here? He says, well, our practices are a little strange. They might be offensive to you. Just let us take our cattle and our herds and we'll go out for a few days and we'll come back. Of course, Pharaoh doesn't believe this. And eventually, what comes down is the battle of the gods, sometimes known as the stories of the plagues. This is one of the little known things, not little known, but one of the often missed and overlooked parts of Exodus. Is that once again, this is a battle of gods. In the ancient world, communities believed that other communities had gods and deities. They just believed that their God was the strongest. It's very likely the Hebrew people would have believed that there were gods of Egypt. They just believed that their God was superior and stronger. And the way that that was proved in the ancient world was how your people did. Did they prosper? Were they producing heirs? Were they multiplying? Then they were blessed by God. Did they win in battles and war? That meant God was on their side. Did they overcome and were they protected from natural disasters or did they survive these things? That was the intervention of God. And what happens in the plagues is you see Pharaoh representing humanity in its stubbornness, saying, I have my own gods, my own way, my own power. And God continuing to say, sorry, no, you don't. I am God. I am creator. I'm in control. And what happens is each of the plagues can correspond with an Egyptian god or goddess. And that would have been the person that you would have tried to pray to alleviate the plague. So, for example, when the Nile turns to blood, you would pray to Happy, the god of the Nile. When you see frogs starting to invade, frogs are a symbol of fertility and life. You would have gone and prayed to Heket, Geb, the god of earth, when the dust of the earth turns to lice. Hathor, the goddess of the sky, love and protection, flies from foreign lands are sent out to Egypt. Apis, the bull deity, when their livestock started to die. Isis, the goddess of medicine and peace. Oh, that's okay. You too. Would have been who you would pray to if you were sick and you had boils and sores in the plague of boils and sores. Seth, who is the god of storms and disorder. You might have prayed to Seth to try and stop the hail and the lightning that destroyed crops and killed cattle and people. Nut, the goddess of the sky. You may have prayed for her to stop the locusts that were descending from the sky. Ra, the sun god, that you would have prayed to during the plague of darkness. And finally, Pharaoh, who is a god on earth, the ultimate power of Egypt, loses his son, the firstborn, who would have become a god on earth as well. This is important because we see that all of these people, all of these deities, all of these so-called efforts that we have created to try and make it feel like we have control over things like tides and plagues and weather and illnesses and so much more, even over life and death, these efforts turn out to be fruitless and futile because God is who truly has this power. And as this conflict goes on, this becomes more and more clear. Again, I wonder if this is another attempt for God to try and bless more people, because as more and more Egyptians see the power of God overcoming the power to their gods, they become, and according to the Bible, they follow the Egyptian or the Israelites. They join them. They look favorably upon them. They give them cattle and money and stores. They even leave Egypt with them to follow God, their God. And therefore, more people are blessed and become part of God's kingdom. So this battle goes on, and eventually the Pharaoh relents, lets the people leave. They leave, they go down to the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on your translation. And Pharaoh regrets his choice and sends the army after them in one last futile effort of strength and butchery to try and reclaim his power. God, of course, does not allow that. We have the Red Sea opening. The Israelites cross over the sea. The Egyptians drown. And God's power is again cemented in the eyes of their people. And this is where we meet Miriam with her full name. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out with her after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Miriam is described as a prophet, not as a wife, not as a mother. She is identified as Aaron's sister, but before that, she is described as a prophet. And this is amazing because she becomes a leader. The women follow her in worship and praise for God. They follow her in dance and song, in the creative act of celebrating. And Miriam continues to play a part in the leadership during the time that the Israelites are in exile in Numbers and Deuteronomy. In fact, in Numbers, she will even challenge Moses's prophetic authority with her brother Aaron. They will get angry at Moses for having a foreign wife. That might be Zipporah, that might be another woman that he's married. We don't know. But she will say, "Has the Lord not also spoken through us?" And God will come and kind of put Aaron and Miriam in their place by saying, "I speak through lots of people, but with Moses it's different. I speak clearly and plainly." What's clear is there's probably a power struggle going on between them, which is interesting because it means that Miriam was powerful enough for her to there to be a struggle. Both are reprimanded by this. Miriam bears the punishment, though. She is stricken with leprosy and must wait outside the camp for 7 days. Aaron begs Moses, Moses begs God, and God says she's got to be outside the camp for 7 days to prove she's not, so she's no longer contagious. But the people don't move on without Miriam. They continue to wait for her until she can once again enter the camp. And again, this shows the reach and depth of her influence in the lives of the people there. Miriam was someone important whose life, teaching, and leadership was valued by her community. And the fact that her name is again recorded and her song is recorded demonstrate that. And again, they talk about how we see how God is once again at work through people that may otherwise be marginalized or forgotten. Miriam becomes a leader in her own right. It's interesting to note that Miriam is the Hebrew version of the name Mary. And like their namesakes in the New Testament, the Marys we meet there will sing songs of deliverance. They will embody a demon or disease and be cured of it. And they will challenge male authority. And that's just the beginning. God creates both men and women and works through them both. And when we leave one gender out of the story or overly sexualize them, when we do include them, we diminish the beauty and amazement of God's creation. What we really see here are both women and men standing in the face of terror. But it's important to make a note about women here because so often we overlook their roles and the impacts they have. In 2012, a study came out that said that there had been more women had been killed through violence than people were killed in all of the modern wars up until that time. So that would mean that more women were killed in terrorism, violence, and oppression as a result of these things than people were killed in wars like World War One, II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Desert Storm, all of these wars up until 2012 combined. And that doesn't include the women who died from those wars because they were only looking at women who died outside of that kind of violence. The fact that thousands of Indigenous women go missing or are found dead and their crimes are never solved, their bodies are not recovered, their mysteries remain, there's no closure. The fact that women continue to fight for equal access to education and wages, the different expectations placed upon them as genders, all of these things are still very much with us today. And while women are often the victims of terror, their voices can play a vital role in promoting peace and breaking the cycles of terror and poverty. Recent UN studies show that when men and women together are involved in peace talks in significant ways, there's a 35% more likely chance that those talks will result in a lasting change, and that peace can continue even up to 15 years later. The beauty of this is not that it excludes the voices of men from the table, but that it listens to both sides. It listens to men and women together. It says the terror that is happening, the war that is happening, the violence that is happening impacts women as well as men, and that if we're going to find a solution for that, we need to listen to both women and men. And when we do that, we see lasting change. Women can be wonderful, beautiful, powerful forces for peace, just like men can. Women can also be very violent and a little bit scary, as we're going to find out when we meet Jayal in a couple weeks. But more so than that, they can be creative forces that help us stand and rebuild in the ruin of the world, especially when given equal opportunity to do so. It is through faithful action of both men and women that the power of God is demonstrated to be stronger than any of the other gods or powers of the world in the book of Exodus. We see God at work in both of them. And when we retell that story in modern days, we need to remember to include these women and their voices, just like we need to remember to include women as we look for solutions for our world going forward. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this has been interesting and helpful to you. As always, I'm happy to take questions, and I hope we will see you next week when we will be studying Rahab. I know I said we'd be doing Judges earlier, but I had my order wrong. So we will be doing Rahab, and if you'd like to read ahead a little bit, you can find her story in the book of Joshua. God bless, and see you next week.